Thank you. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Elisa, for the gracious invitation. My apologies for speaking in English. I'll speak slowly because if I spoke in Spanish, it'll be a disaster for everybody, and that's a poor way to start the day. I tend to speak slowly, so hopefully we can follow, but if not, I think there is translation available, so that's okay. Great. So, as Elisa mentioned, I'm currently at the University of Birmingham, and I research urban climate adaptation and have been doing so for the past 10 years or so. I'm moving to California imminently, so you see two affiliations up there. The objective of the next 30 minutes or so is to give you a sense of how adaptation is being implemented in two megacities around the world. Believe it or not, Europe, Spain, and the Basque region are quite advanced when talking about climate change adaptation at the city level. I'm American, I'm from the US, and you can imagine that the federal level, the national level, the rhetoric is much different. I study the global south, and so developing countries, and again, the context is very different. So you can imagine that the European experience is quite unique in the global situation. So I want to tell you for the next 30 minutes or so two stories of cities, New York City and also Jakarta, Indonesia, that have very unique environmental conditions, but hopefully will have some lessons, even though they are slightly behind in adaptation, have lessons for the local context here in Europe to try to get a sense of what's happening. The points above here are points that we all sort of know in terms of why adaptation is important. So I don't want to belabor any of these points, but we're trying to understand how spaces, how people, how infrastructure are responding to the uncertain climate change impacts that will happen for the next 20, 50, 100 years. And so that poses a huge planning and policy challenge because we're trying to use previous projections of environmental change to project into the future and try to determine what can or cannot happen, try to superimpose those scenarios onto policy, infrastructure design, and human development trajectories that may or may not fit that particular kind of logic. And so I'm speaking about a particular kind of logic here, but I'll talk about that later. That particular logic is really complex and really vague, as we all know. And so the argument here is that local communities, urban authorities, cities are a really good space to test out some of this logic for what to do about climate change, because the assumption is that city level, urban authority level agents and actors are at a much more suitable scale to test out different policies. It's slightly smaller. There are fairly distinct departmental sectoral lines that we can start to integrate these objectives into. City authorities, assumed, are a bit closer to the electorate, and so that if there are concerns from the bottom up, from the grassroots level, city authorities are much more able to manage that because they're a little bit closer to the people. Cities are often closer to the infrastructures themselves, and so they tend to, together with regional authorities, have managerial and operational responsibilities over these infrastructures. So, as you can imagine, oftentimes we look at cities as these testing grounds of adaptation policies and infrastructure designs as a way to complement, if not supplement, national level policy directions and directives. Because sometimes national level policies tend to get sidetracked by different kinds of agenda items, and so the idea is that we would approach these both levels of government simultaneously to figure out what adaptation can or cannot be. And so for the past 10 years or so, me and a whole group of researchers have been looking into this rising phenomena of urban adaptation planning around the world. And so these are a selection of early adaptation plans that were very much driven by a global directive that we, at the global level, across the climate change negotiations, are saying that, hang on, mitigation is really important. However, the system has some sort of environmental change built in already, and so we must address adaptation. Let's focus on the city level together with having to work with national governments, and here are the different plans that are have been come up with. What we are learning is that this kind of planning is very familiar to the planners and practitioners in cities already. The logic here is that we're using traditional, typical planning tools around finance, around housing, around transport, around energy, inserting a certain kind of climate logic into these sort of distinct planning arenas, and then designing these iterative problem-solving, testing, and evaluation assessment metrics that go with this. And so it's very typical planning, kind of introductory planning, university level. This is the process that we're talking about, but a distinctly climate adaptation interest, the uncertainty, the complexity kind of built into it. For the past 10 years or so, much of this planning has been institutional in nature. So we're talking about regulations, we're talking about finance and budgets, we're talking about building designs, engineering plans. So the soft stuff of planning and policymaking, building institutions, building participatory arenas, building the kinds of financial pathways that allow for the support of adaptation at the city level. However, now that we've had more than a decade of institution building around adaptation, trying to get the adequate leadership around this particular agenda, getting the right amount of awareness and knowledge around the need for adaptation, getting the kinds of participatory arenas set up so that citizens can translate, can understand the level of uncertainty in the 50 to 100-year timescale. Now that all of this institution has been built for many cities, not all, we've moved on to the next phase of implementation. And implementation is interesting because then you sort of move into how do we operationalize, how do we action some of the more political elements of adaptation. And before I launch into the New York and Jakarta examples, just to give you a sense of the kinds of messages that'll come out at the end of this. One key message is that adaptation, despite the science and the kind of technocratic approach to the planning logic that I just talked about, and despite the real need to build infrastructure, to build housing, to build settlements, to deal with the uncertainty of impacts, adaptation at the end of the day is very, very political because it deals with very different sorts of conflicts that people have around what is important for their day-to-day life, around how cities prioritize their development agendas, and how people and cities work with each other, often in conflicting situations, to decide what the city ought to be, what the city should be in 50, 100 years, given the kinds of scenarios. And so the two stories here will very much illustrate these sorts of contentious dynamics that are going on. And they try to explain what happens from the generation of the plans, the written plan itself, the building of the institutions, to what actually is built or not at the end of the planning process. The first example here is New York City, that for North America, it is quite advanced in adaptation planning. So here are two particular kinds of impacts that New York City faces. One is sea level rise, which is on the left-hand side. And if you look at that, it's different colors, and my apologies if the colors are not showing up, but it shows the 2050, 100-year levels of sea level rise that the city will experience. and you see certain areas of the city that are going to be inundated because of this. And a lot of it is key infrastructure. So the really large part that's green at the bottom there is the airport. There's a lot on Manhattan. If you recognize a lot of the coastal parts of Manhattan, financially important central business district areas that will be at risk from sea level rise in the next couple of decades. The map on the right is urban heat, which the city has also identified as a particularly important climate impact. New York City is very dense. New York City is also home to a lot of minority and at-risk neighborhoods, and you start to see the kinds of heat dynamics correspond to areas that have a particular kind of density, have a particular kind of ethnic and human makeup to them. And so the city, through this kind of participatory institutional building exercise, that is through the creation of the New York City Climate Change Task Force, solicited citizen input, went around the city, all different neighborhoods of the city, to try to figure out what are the key risks. And so sea level rise and urban heat came up. They talked to 5 key sectors that they thought would be most impacted by these 2 risks, which is information communication technology, the energy distribution supply infrastructure, transportation, so roads, public transit, airports, water and waste, sea level rise, solid waste management, and then also this policy context, leadership, finance, urban planning, design. And so the working group was led by sectoral agency heads of these 5 sectors that created the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force that interacted with the larger New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a replica of the international Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but housed at a university. And so this is the scientific body, the city-level scientific body that assesses climate change impacts, vulnerabilities, but also mitigation, energy transition pathways. So it's a replication. It's a replica of the global version at the city level. And so the 2 work together. And then the top 2 boxes is the public authority, is the city itself. So the mayor and the city sustainability office. And so this is the institutional architecture that they spent 10 years working on. And there's also university actors, NGOs, community groups. And so if you were to ask me what is a good example of a participatory adaptation planning process, New York City tends to come up quite frequently because of this fairly unique architecture that has been built. 2 examples of what came out of it. These 2 are very recent plans. The Cool Neighborhoods New York City, so this is specifically addressing urban heat, came out in November last year. And then the Waterfront Revitalization Plan came out earlier this year. And so this is under Mayor Bill de Blasio, who really took on some of these adaptation mandates and became a strong advocate and strong leader. And so these are 2 plans. If you're interested, please go online and just find it. They're very long plans. They're 50+ pages long. But through the participatory process, the urban heat plan thought to build in street trees, to paint roofs white to reflect heat, to have cool and permeable pavements, so that rather than having gray and dark color streets, they would paint it green or other more reflective colors, or put in playgrounds and parks that would create this kind of open space so that you would have air ventilation across. But also, the plan spends a great deal of pages talking about risk communication in at-risk neighborhoods. So these African-American concentration neighborhoods that are relatively more vulnerable to heat, they actually go in and do media events, do community action awareness events to tell people about what to do when the temperatures rise to a certain level. Where are the cooling centers? How do we actually get and pay for air conditioning? All these things that are very important. And the bottom example is the waterfront plan, which, as you recall a couple slides ago, sea level rise is an important issue. And so revitalizing the waterfronts inputting this kind of infrastructure that is protective, but also regenerating the city, economically regenerating the city, was a huge, important issue. And so here are some examples of the pictures of the photos from that plan. On the right here, on the left here is Lower Manhattan, so the financial center for New York City, basically building in a kind of green infrastructure ecosystem, quote unquote, based adaptation measure that puts in a lot of trees, green spaces, permeable surfaces, all along the coastline here, to try to deal with the kinds of uncertain sea level changes so that if something happens, it's not so bad, it's more or less natural, we can regenerate that fairly quickly. But at the same time, it provides certain levels of recreational areas for residents to use when it's nice out. And this is something that the city thought would be co-beneficial, so having two benefits at once, allowing for this kind of adaptation. Some of you may have read the news saying that this plan, despite the participatory nature of it and the strong science and advocacy around it, is quite controversial because people interpret it as gentrification. The amount of environmental upgrading, the nicer the place it gets, environmental quality of the place higher it is, the more expensive the neighborhood becomes. Because people like to live in these areas, because people value ecosystem services and they value the amenities, the environmental amenities of the place. And so New York City is a place of high rents. Putting in this kind of adaptation infrastructure increased rents even more. Nonetheless, this is ongoing, and we can check in in 10 years' time to see what happens. But this is very much the political leader's position, and this is the plan and design that is going forth. Example 2, Jakarta. We're just moving right around the world for a couple minutes here. Megacity again, coastal, financial, economic, political center, sea level rise, huge, huge issue. So contextually, fairly similar to New York, though obviously income and wealth levels vastly different, and the amount of people vastly different. This is a city of about 25 million. The city is actually sinking. It's sinking quite fast. It's sinking about 2 or 3 millimeters every year. So it's a subsiding city, but it's also a growing city at the same time, because as you see at the bottom, these satellite data, over the past 40 years or so, the city has just grown and grown and grown. And so this is what happens. In many developing countries, you see a lot of in-migration for jobs, employment opportunities, and many of these migrants start to congregate around river banks, fluvial plain, floodplain areas, because these are areas that were previously not developed and are relatively cheap to occupy or to squat or to settle. And so you start to see marginal, disadvantaged communities congregate in these environmentally vulnerable at-risk areas. And given the sinking nature of the city and the kinds of sea level rise projections you see, clearly these areas are at the front lines of sea level rise. And so this is the impacts of that. The person in white in that photo was formerly the governor of Jakarta region and now the president of Indonesia. And so he was very keen to think through what to do with this kind of sea level rise. And these communities, flood bank communities, were also heavily voting for him. So he needed to kind of get this kind of awareness to deal with the kinds of sea level rise that we're talking about. So between 2011, 2014, to deal with the sinking city and sea level rise, this is the plan that was drawn up by the governor and a Dutch consultancy. So this is the Dutch-Indonesia colonial connection. And so this is the National Capital Redevelopment Plan, 2014. what you see here, the orange, yellowy orange areas will be new reclaimed islands out in the bay to block the sea. All the grayish white areas are existing areas, and because Jakarta is so dense, transportation is so bad, there was a huge interest in alleviating that, and so creating new road bypasses on top of the seawall was a priority. Priority number 2 was that the city wanted a new central business district, which currently was very dispersed around the city. Okay, let's build that on top of the seawall as well. To build the seawall required a lot of infrastructure upgrading, so dredging the existing river canals, creating different kinds of blockages, moving communities left and right because they needed to construct an area and they didn't have enough space. And so it was going to be a 20-year kind of plan to move people around the city. As you can imagine, that is also very, very contentious. And there was huge uproar when this plan was announced because of this. So this was the artist's rendering of what was going to happen. It was sold as a seawall. Climate change, really, really important, a priority for all of us. Our city is sinking. Our city is going to be inundated by seawater in the next 50 years. We are going to build a giant seawall so that we block all of that and we can all be very, very happy and safe. That was the message that was sent, but it was not interpreted as that because of this drawing, because we see a financial center on top of it. We see the new finance glitzy area highlighted, everybody else not. And the symbolic meaning behind it. The island is shaped like the giant Garuda, which is the national symbol of Indonesia. The political rhetoric, if you ask people about it, is that we want Jakarta to have a new central business district that is separated from all the rest of the people, so that international businesses, Europeans, North Americans can invest and be comfortable and not have to deal with the traffic jams everybody else has to. They're separated from everybody else. And by the way, it looks like our national symbol because this is our tool to become a first world developed country. And having this diagram, having adaptation in our back, we can justify this kind of development pattern now. Okay. So if we want to do that, then we'll see. Again, it was so, so contentious. And so communities that were going to be displaced, as you can imagine, rose up and said, no, this is ridiculous, this is not happening. And so communities, many of those that were going to be displaced, came together and started talking about alternatives. What can we do that doesn't involve this kind of huge, huge re-envisioning, redesigning of the whole city? Can we think about adaptation in a way that doesn't displace everybody? Can we think about adaptation in a way that's a bit more equitable, maybe, that doesn't focus on global financial institutions? Yes, I think Jakarta people recognize that business and industry are very important parts of the city, but I mean, it doesn't mean that all the infrastructure has to go to them. I mean, there's a lot of need everywhere else. And so this is one example of an alternative scenario. This is a community-led housing redesign, which basically came up with designs for different kinds of floating shelters, different kinds of vertical shelters, so that water can go underneath the house. And if you densify neighborhoods this way, you can have a smaller footprint, keep the kinds of social amenities, schools, elderly centers, keep families and small businesses together, but living with water, which is the very Dutch way of thinking about things. And having trees and all that in between as well, so having the neighborhood upgrade ideal in there as well. So this was an alternative that sort of gained traction. And so what happened, the governor, so now president of Indonesia, saw this much backlash against the capital redevelopment plan. Last year he canceled it, which, for better or worse, you can interpret, however, that is, but it gives you a sense of how the political outcome, or the political process through which adaptation has to go through. Adaptation as an agenda itself needs to attach to other things to gather support, coalitions, and mainstream it, integrate it into existing development. And that process is hugely contentious and can be pulled in all sorts of different directions. And the Jakarta example shows us that it can be pulled into international finance, it can be pulled into a certain kind of urban redesign that deals with infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure. And that entails a lot of power. And whoever situated in the city that has more power has more ability to pull that agenda in a certain direction, to a point where the intention of adaptation, so dealing with environmental risks, oftentimes does not directly correspond to what actually is implemented on the ground. And so the Jakarta plan received so much backlash that the outcome of the design was so far from what everybody had originally thought it would be, it was just simply canceled. The government said it was too expensive. Clearly it's very expensive, but they would have spent the money if they had the backing. Insights. And so with those two stories in mind, and with the decade or so of thinking through these long-term planning and implementation processes, I think I want to talk about three key messages that I sort of highlighted already at the beginning. Adaptation, yes, on a day-to-day basis, is incremental planning to deal with the kinds of uncertainties and risks that cities and regions have to deal with. However, fundamentally, adaptation is about visioning where the city ought to be and should be or can be in 50, 100-year time frame. Because we're talking about environmental risks that are this long. And so planning for adaptation entails visions that are much longer in time frame. And the visioning process is hugely contentious because we all have different aspirations, we all have different hopes for what it can be. Citizens have one version, politicians may have a different version, businesses and global finance certainly has a different version of that vision. And so it's about how do we navigate these different long-term visions so that we can then look back and say, okay, what are the steps that we need to get there? Scientific assessments is only one small part in that very wide political vision of the city. Second, with this huge vision in mind, the incremental portions of it have to do with legislations, have to do with rules, have to do with finance. All of this are really kind of embedded in the stories that I told you just now. But all of these policies, these institutions, these people, they deal with trade-offs on a day-to-day basis. And much of the planning process, though when I showed you many slides ago the circular figures, it seems very technocratic, it's kind of expert-driven. It's really not at the end of the day. It's about managing trade-offs. What can I do in this area to increase land values and adaptation at the same time? But I have to displace about 20 households. Is that a decision that I'm willing to make? That decision is embedded in the ideology of the economics itself, or the ideology of the city, but it's also about very, very divergent and diverse interests of citizens. And so this is, again, the same message that's coming through. It's adaptation. The incremental adaptation planning approach is much more about managing citizen and business and political interests rather than dealing with the instruments of policy and finance. That we all, I mean, many of you have worked in government, and that we have rules and regulations and kind of written policy documents for that. Whether or not that's actually followed is a different question, but they exist. Much more of the day-to-day activity deals with managing interests and how do we balance the trade-offs associated with all of that. And then finally, a message that often comes out when you go out to Jakarta and you go out to New York City is that there's a huge difference between what is planned, what is thought of, what is visioned at the planning level versus what is wanted and what is needed at the local level. And so wherever you go, issues of equity, participation, inclusion are very, very front and center. And you see this in Europe as well. It's not just a North American, it's not just an Asian example. What you see is that our bad experience and our inability in the past 10 years to manage these trade-offs, to manage these conflicting interests, because we thought of adaptation as a much more technocratic exercise with engineers. It is very important. It is certainly a technocratic exercise because we have infrastructures, we need engineered things to deal with the kinds of impacts that we're talking about. However, the managing interests, managing trade-offs, building these inclusive coalitions, they were sidelined. These agendas were sidelined. And so what you have was the engineered urban future dominating all sorts of other different visions. And so what we need is a better process to balance the two a bit and have the ground-up grassroots approaches, ideals, visions of what adaptation should be speak more closely to what has actually been done at the city and the engineered level of things. And so this is just a summary of the 3 points that I made. But I think the last point is something that I want to leave you with, which is adaptation is increasing in awareness. People are beginning to aware of the need of adaptation as well as mitigation. And so adaptation is a really good way to start thinking about these very big questions of what do we want our society to look like, given the ecological risks, given these scenarios, and given the kinds of development interests that we all have. Let's think through, in a very kind of inclusive and structured way, what is and what should our city be in the next 50, 100 years? Is it the vision that New York City has, the ecosystem-based kind of coastline management, where we're protecting central business districts, but basically the ecosystem infrastructure is protecting Wall Street. That's basically what it is. Is it the vision that Jakarta has, that we want huge investments into environmental security to block off all the sea, all the ocean, and then do the kind of rearranging that the city wants? Or is it something else? I mean, there's so many different options out there, so many different visions, and there's so much scope for creativity and innovation in this sphere that there's a lot of conversation yet to be had, but a lot of it has to deal with reorienting how we're doing things already. And I presented this last slide at the UN Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva not that long ago, and they sort of kind of distilled this as the 3 V's principle, which is visions, values, and voices, which more or less sort of summarizes the past several slides. But it's worth us to think through the vision of adaptation. What is the long-term goal here? The values. What do we value in adaptation? How do we prioritize? How do we assess those? How do we develop metrics that are equitable and inclusive to kind of deal with those values? And what are the voices? Who are the voices? Who is not missing? Who is missing? Who's not there? Who needs more voices? Who needs more awareness and knowledge to actually make a voice? And how do we account for voices that are yet to come? Those kinds of things. So that's it. I hope that was interesting. And I hope I didn't go too quickly.